Beneath the shining facades of Charleston's 19th-century streets, beneath the marble porches and soft southern manners, there existed a shadow far deeper than mere human cruelty. The Widow of Charleston was not simply a woman of her time. She was the embodiment of a society's unconscious desire to maintain control, power, and possession at any cost. Her actions, grotesque as they may seem, were not born out of madness alone, but from the very foundation upon which her world was built. In every society that prides itself on refinement and order, there hides an opposite force, the repressed truth, the unspoken wrong, the buried guilt that festers beneath civility. This widow's house was the perfect symbol of that contradiction. Elegant curtains, silver cutlery, manicured gardens, and behind it all, the machinery of human suffering. It was not only the plantation fields that were haunted, but the parlors and bedrooms, where the illusion of gentility was upheld by a quiet, relentless brutality. The Widow of Charleston became a mirror for the collective soul of her city, reflecting the corruption that everyone sensed but refused to acknowledge. The essence of this story lies not in a single act of cruelty, but in the way the human mind can divide itself, how it can perform monstrous deeds while wearing the mask of morality. The people of Charleston believed themselves civilized, Christian, righteous. They built churches, hosted charity balls, and spoke of honor. Yet, behind that illusion, human beings were treated as cattle, and even within that system, there were degrees of horror too great to be spoken of. The breeding of slaves, orchestrated and justified as economic necessity, was the most perverse manifestation of that hidden darkness. The widow's use of her daughters in this scheme shows not just moral collapse, but psychological disintegration. To transform one's own blood into instruments of production is to dissolve the boundary between humanity and property, love and possession. This was no longer a mere social sin. It was an internal war where the conscience of an entire culture had turned against itself. In this shadowed world, the widow did not act alone. She carried the unspoken approval of the system around her, the whisper of neighbors who would never confront her, the laws that protected her right to own other lives. When the collective soul of a people embraces blindness as comfort, individuals like her emerge as its symbols. Her cruelty was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. She was the hand that performed what others silently permitted. Through her, the suppressed guilt of a nation found expression. Every generation hides something it refuses to face, and in Charleston's case, it was the simple truth that their wealth was built upon human misery. The widow's story brings that truth out of the shadows, forcing us to look at how far the mind will go to preserve its illusions of righteousness. Psychologically, her actions represent a profound split within the self. To maintain power over others, she had to silence the voice of empathy. To exploit the bodies of her daughters, she had to sever the bond of motherhood from its natural compassion. Each moral boundary broken required another layer of justification until the monstrous became ordinary. This is the nature of the shadow, the part of the soul that grows stronger the more it is denied. The more the society around her celebrated grace and faith, the deeper its hypocrisy grew, feeding the very evil it pretended to condemn. In Charleston's grand drawing rooms, one could hear hymns and laughter, yet behind the walls, the cries of the enslaved echoed unheard. That dissonance created a sickness that spread through generations, corrupting not only those who inflicted pain, but also those who ignored it. The Widow of Charleston, in this sense, was the priestess of a dark ritual, preserving order through suffering, sanctifying cruelty with justification, believing herself chosen by fate or necessity. She likely saw her acts as a form of preservation, as a grim practicality. Yet beneath her reasoning lay fear, the fear of losing power, wealth, and control. Fear is the root of all cruelty. It drives the human mind to deny truth, to destroy what threatens its illusion of mastery. Her fear of poverty, her fear of weakness, her fear of the changing world, all these became transmuted into domination. In controlling others, she sought to silence her own terror. This is why her story is not merely historical but archetypal. She represents the eternal human tendency to destroy others in the name of order, to disguise fear as authority. But the shadow she embodied did not belong to her alone. The same darkness lived in the heart of Charleston, in the polite silence of those who knew but said nothing. Her wealth depended on a network of approval, legal and social, that made evil seem ordinary. The judges, traders, priests, and ladies of her circle each contributed a thread to the web that made her actions possible. Thus, her mansion was not merely a personal home, it was a temple of a collective lie. The same lie whispered through the entire nation, a lie that proclaimed liberty while denying it to millions, that preached faith while practicing exploitation. The Widow of Charleston was simply the face of that lie made flesh, and yet there is an even deeper meaning in her tale. The shadow, when revealed, does not exist to condemn but to awaken. The story of this widow exposes the terrible truth that every civilization must eventually confront, that progress, beauty, and refinement mean nothing if built upon denial. To see her not only as a villain, but as a manifestation of the human psyche, is to understand the necessity of confronting the hidden parts of our collective soul. Her secret, and Charleston's, is humanity's secret. The capacity to create suffering through the pursuit of comfort, to disguise evil as necessity, to silence conscience in the name of survival. Until that shadow is brought into light, it remains alive in every age, repeating its patterns in new forms. So the Widow of Charleston, though dead and forgotten by history, lives on in symbol. She stands as the reflection of that ancient conflict between light and darkness within the human heart. Her mansion may crumble, her name may fade, but the truth she reveals cannot. For as long as we refuse to see the shadows of our own making, her story will echo again, reminding us that no civilization can call itself free until it dares to face the darkness it hides within its soul. The widow's story is the story of the mother archetype twisted into its darkest form, a distortion of creation into consumption, nurturing into domination. The very essence of motherhood is to give life, to protect, to sustain. Yet in the Widow of Charleston, this instinct was inverted until it became a force of destruction disguised as preservation. Her children were not born from love, but from calculation, and her daughters were not cherished as extensions of her soul, but used as extensions of her will. This corruption of the maternal role reflects something deeper than personal cruelty. It reveals the sickness of a world that had turned the act of giving life into a tool of profit. When motherhood is stripped of its sanctity and used to serve power, it ceases to be divine and becomes monstrous. The widow, in this sense, was not only a woman acting out of greed, but a symbol of how society itself had desecrated the sacred feminine. She became the mother who devours rather than nourishes, the one who consumes her own offspring to sustain her dominance over others. Within the confines of her Charleston mansion, motherhood became a kind of industry. Her daughters' bodies were commodified, their wombs turned into instruments of production, their innocence sacrificed at the altar of economic security. To justify such acts, the widow must have constructed an entire inner mythology, convincing herself that she was ensuring survival, maintaining legacy, or fulfilling divine order. Every human being creates narratives to mask their own darkness, and hers was no exception. In her mind, perhaps, she believed she was saving her family from ruin after her husband's death, using the only means available in a society that prized wealth above morality. But behind that rationalization lay a deeper terror, the fear of powerlessness, of losing control, of descending into the same vulnerability as those she enslaved. The widow's need for control consumed every natural instinct of love until she became something hollow, a mother in body but not in spirit. Her daughters, raised in an environment of emotional subjugation, became both victims and symbols of that corruption. They were conditioned to equate obedience with virtue, silence with safety, and compliance with love. Their mother's influence stretched into every corner of their existence, molding their perception of right and wrong. To defy her was to face not just punishment, but exile from the fragile world of privilege that surrounded them. Their suffering was internal, invisible, and suffocating. Each of them carried the unbearable contradiction of being both subject and object, human beings turned into instruments, vessels for the continuation of their mother's power. Their trauma did not manifest in rebellion but in quiet resignation, because in a society that defined women by their usefulness to men and their obedience to authority, even their pain was made invisible. The widow's household became a microcosm of the larger institution of slavery itself, a structure that turned bodies into property, emotions into liabilities, and life itself into a commodity. The corruption of the mother archetype also reflects the psychological collapse of a world that had lost its balance between masculine and feminine energies. In a natural order, the mother represents compassion, empathy, and creation, while the father represents order, authority, and structure. But in Charleston's slaveholding society, the masculine principle of dominance had devoured the feminine principle of care. Even the women of that world were forced to embody cruelty, to mimic the hardness of their male counterparts in order to survive within the oppressive system. The Widow of Charleston became a manifestation of that imbalance, a woman forced to embody power in its most destructive form because her society offered no place for tenderness without weakness. Her cruelty was, in part, the result of her environment's expectations. In a culture that rewarded control and punished vulnerability, her maternal instincts were weaponized. The natural impulse to nurture became an impulse to dominate. The desire to protect became a desire to possess. Thus, she became both product and prisoner of her world's moral decay. Her daughters bore the generational wound of this corruption. What they inherited from their mother was not just wealth or status, but trauma, a deep psychic imprint that would follow them into every part of their existence. The cycle of control and submission replicated itself in their hearts. They would pass it unconsciously to their own children, not through action but through silence, through the absence of love freely given. In this way, the widow's sin extended far beyond her lifetime. It became a legacy of spiritual distortion, echoing through generations. In psychological terms, when the mother's love becomes conditional, the child's sense of self becomes fractured. The daughters learn to see their worth only through their usefulness, their existence only through service, their femininity only through suffering. They were denied the sacred experience of being loved for who they were, and that denial would haunt every relationship that followed. This entire dynamic, the widow consuming her daughter's innocence to preserve her own power, reflects the archetype of the devouring mother, a figure that has appeared in human consciousness across myths and ages. She is the one who feeds on her children's vitality, who smothers them under the weight of her control, who mistakes possession for love. The Widow of Charleston embodied this archetype not merely as an individual but as a collective truth. She represented a civilization feeding on its own offspring to maintain its illusion of superiority. The daughters symbolized the lost feminine, stripped of voice, autonomy, and identity. Their suffering was not only personal, it was the voice of every woman silenced under patriarchy, every soul denied freedom in the name of preservation. Yet, within this darkness, their lies a revelation. Even in the widow's monstrous transformation, one can sense the buried remains of her original nature, the part of her that once might have loved, that once might have cared. That spark did not die. It was buried under the rubble of fear and greed. And it is in recognizing that buried light within the darkness that understanding begins. For the corruption of the maternal is not only a story of evil, but a warning. When power replaces empathy, when control replaces compassion, humanity itself begins to consume its own children. The Widow of Charleston shows us that the destruction of love begins not with hatred, but with fear. The fear of loss, the fear of change, the fear of being powerless in a world built on domination. Thus, her motherhood became a tragedy, not only for her daughters, but for herself. In attempting to preserve her family's legacy, she destroyed its soul. In trying to maintain order, she birthed chaos. The mother who should have been the protector became the oppressor, and in doing so, she became the most haunted figure of all, a woman who gave life only to take it away. The echo of her deeds lingers in history as a reminder that when the sacred bond between mother and child is perverted by power, the entire moral fabric of humanity begins to unravel. The daughters of the Widow of Charleston existed as reflections of their mother's fractured soul, their lives shaped by the invisible chains of obedience, fear, and inherited sin. They were not individuals in her eyes, but extensions of her will, the living instruments through which her control continued and her wealth multiplied. In the dim corridors of their home, silence became their only form of safety. They learned early that to question was to invite wrath, and that love, in their mother's world, was not given freely, but purchased through compliance. Raised under the constant shadow of authority, they internalized their bondage until it became indistinguishable from their identity. Their voices faded beneath the weight of expectation, and the purity of their youth was replaced by a resigned understanding that their lives were not truly their own. Each step they took echoed within the walls of a house built on suffering, a house that taught them that comfort required sacrifice, their own. The psychological burden they carried was immense, for their innocence was poisoned with complicity. Their mother's cruelty was not expressed only in her acts of domination, but in the subtle way she reshaped their sense of self. She taught them that obedience was virtue, that silence was strength, that their bodies were not sacred but utilitarian. To them, morality was rewritten to justify atrocity, and compassion was treated as weakness. In that environment, truth was the one thing forbidden, and so they learned to wear masks, to hide their pain behind still faces and downcast eyes. Each daughter became a broken mirror reflecting fragments of her mother's darkness, and through them, the family's legacy of sin was perpetuated. The human soul cannot endure the contradiction of being both victim and instrument forever, and within their hearts, a silent fracture deepened, a split between who they were and who they were forced to become. Their condition was not unique, but emblematic of a society where women's value was measured by their obedience and their usefulness. In Charleston's elite circles, daughters were rarely raised for freedom. They were groomed for submission under the guise of refinement. But in the widow's household, this cultural sickness reached its extreme. These young women were stripped not only of autonomy, but of the very meaning of femininity. They were taught to nurture life not through love, but through transaction, to see their wombs as tools rather than gifts. What should have been sacred became mechanical. The intimacy of creation, the deep spiritual bond between mother and child, was turned into an act of economic production. Every child they bore under their mother's command carried within it the weight of moral corruption, a life born into slavery through the betrayal of life itself. This horror, though deeply personal, was also psychological and archetypal. It reflected how moral decay seeps through generations when power replaces empathy. The daughters' obedience was not born of love, but of survival. They were captives in their own home, ensnared by an emotional tyranny more effective than any chain. Their mother's manipulation was complete because it wore the disguise of duty. She convinced them that they were preserving the family, that their suffering was noble, even necessary. And so they endured, suppressing their revulsion, silencing the natural instincts of compassion that might have driven them to rebellion. In doing so, they became both carriers and victims of the same disease that had consumed their mother, the belief that the end justified the means, that suffering was the price of stability. In their eyes, the world outside offered no redemption. Charleston society, with its rigid hierarchies and unspoken cruelties, would never have saved them. The community that celebrated wealth while ignoring its origins had no space for truth or confession. Had the daughters spoken, they would not have been believed. Had they resisted, they would have been condemned. Thus, their silence was not weakness, but a distorted form of survival. They lived between two prisons, the physical walls of their mother's mansion and the social walls of a world that denied them agency. Within that dual confinement, their spirits began to erode. Each daughter carried the guilt of their existence like a secret wound. They could neither justify their complicity nor escape it, and that inner torment became their inheritance. In a deeper sense, the daughters represent the feminine soul under patriarchal domination. They symbolize what happens when purity is exploited, when innocence is transformed into labor, and when creation is severed from love. Their mother's corruption did not only enslave them, it extinguished the divine light that resides in every act of genuine creation. Yet, within their silence, something still resisted. There are forms of rebellion that are invisible, acts of defiance that exist only in the heart. Perhaps in the quiet hours of night, as they looked upon the faces of the children they were forced to bear, they felt the first flicker of compassion, the one emotion their mother could not erase. Perhaps they whispered prayers that no one heard, not to the God of their oppressors, but to the one who still recognized them as human. That silent compassion, though powerless in their lifetime, became the seed of moral awakening. Their story also illustrates the way trauma becomes hereditary. The psychological violence inflicted upon them would echo through every generation that followed. Children raised in fear learn to repeat fear. Love that is conditional becomes the only love they know. The daughter's internal conflict, the tension between obedience and conscience, would be transmitted unconsciously to their descendants, long after Charleston's streets had changed and the old houses had fallen into ruin. This is how moral corruption endures, not through memory, but through emotional inheritance. A child who witnesses cruelty learns it as normal, and only through deep reflection can that pattern be broken. The daughter's tragedy is that they lived and died without that chance for reflection, bound within a world that forbade questioning. If one could peer into their inner worlds, one would find a battlefield between guilt and longing. They longed for love but feared it, longed for freedom but could not imagine it. Their entire lives were spent within the narrow confines of expectation, and yet, in some hidden part of their souls, they must have felt the faint awareness that their suffering was unjust. That awareness, though small, was sacred. It was the unextinguished spark of humanity that refused to die even in bondage. In this sense, they were both broken and holy, symbols of endurance amid corruption, of the human capacity to retain some fragment of light, even when buried beneath generations of darkness. Thus, the daughters of Charleston's widow were more than victims of their mother's cruelty. They were symbols of a larger truth about the human psyche and its struggle between conformity and conscience. Their existence asks a timeless question. What becomes of the soul when it is denied its own will? They lived as mirrors, reflecting their mother's sins, yet even shattered mirrors still hold light. And in that flicker, their quiet suffering, their unseen tears, lies the beginning of redemption, not for them alone, but for all who inherit the burden of silence in a world built on oppression. The enslaved souls who lived under the Widow of Charleston's rule carried the deepest and most unspeakable weight of all. They were the living evidence of humanity, stripped of name, freedom, and dignity, yet still bearing within themselves a quiet, indestructible spark. To the widow and her society, they were seen as property, as bodies to be managed, counted, and controlled, but within each of them lived an entire universe of thought, memory, hope, and pain. Their condition was not merely physical bondage, it was an assault on the human spirit. Every breath they took was a struggle between despair and endurance. Yet in that endurance, there existed a silent defiance, the refusal to let the oppressor define the limits of their soul. The enslaved became both witnesses and survivors of a world gone mad, a world where morality had inverted itself so deeply that cruelty was called order and love had to hide to survive. The slaves who were forced into the widow's horrific breeding scheme bore a burden beyond comprehension. They were denied the right to choose, to love, to decide what their own bodies could give or withhold. Their humanity was stolen not just through chains, but through the systematic dismantling of everything that made life sacred. Every act of forced reproduction was a violation of the natural and the divine, turning creation into commerce, motherhood into machinery. Yet even within such horror, the enslaved found ways to reclaim fragments of their stolen humanity. A song hummed softly in the fields, a whispered prayer spoken under the stars, a hand held in secret. These were the invisible acts of rebellion that kept the human spirit alive. In a world where every part of their existence was controlled, the act of remembering that they were human became the most radical defiance imaginable. The widow and her society believed they owned these people completely, but there are parts of the human soul that cannot be possessed. No whip, no chain, no law can bind the inner consciousness that knows its own worth. The slaves of Charleston carried that knowledge like a hidden flame. They were forced to bear children who would be born into the same captivity, yet even then, they planted within those children the seeds of something unbreakable. Through stories, through faith, through the smallest gestures of care, they passed on the awareness that they were more than what their masters claimed them to be. The widow's house, for all its wealth and power, was filled with ghosts, not the supernatural kind, but the spirits of the living who refused to die inside. The enslaved lived in quiet defiance, their very survival a testimony against the world that sought to erase them. Psychologically, the enslaved carried not only their suffering, but also the distorted projections of their oppressors. The widow's cruelty was not just an expression of greed. It was an attempt to suppress her own shadow, to rid herself of the humanity she feared to face. Every master needs a slave, not just to control, but to deny the truth within themselves. The enslaved became mirrors reflecting the hidden sins of those who owned them. The more the widow sought to dehumanize them, the more they represented the humanity she had lost. This dynamic created a spiritual paradox. Those who were called property were, in truth, more spiritually alive than those who claimed to own them. Their suffering had stripped away illusion and revealed the essence of what it means to be human, to feel, to hope, to endure. The pain of the enslaved was not confined to their bodies. It was carved into their identities, into the very fabric of their being. Each humiliation, each separation, each act of violence etched itself into memory, creating a wound that would echo for generations. Yet within those wounds was a strange kind of wisdom, the knowledge that pain does not destroy the soul unless the soul consents to its destruction. The enslaved of Charleston carried this wisdom in silence. They could not write it in books or speak it in courts, but it lived in their songs, in the rhythm of their work, in the way they looked at one another with unspoken understanding. In those quiet exchanges, there was something eternal, something sacred that no whip could touch. The widow may have believed she was breeding more slaves, but in truth she was giving birth to witnesses, children whose very existence carried both the tragedy and the defiance of their parents. These children were born into bondage, yet within them burned the potential of freedom, the echo of a truth that would one day rise from the ashes of that dark era. The enslaved understood something their masters never could, that the body can be controlled but the spirit cannot. This realization gave them strength beyond comprehension. They knew that every act of cruelty inflicted upon them revealed more about their captor's sickness than their own worth. They bore their suffering not as acceptance but as endurance, as the stubborn insistence that they would not let the evil around them define the core of who they were. Their spirituality became both shield and weapon. For many, faith was not the religion of their oppressors, but a personal covenant with the divine, one unmediated by those who enslaved them. They saw God not as the deity of the widow's sermons, but as the quiet voice that spoke to them in the dark, the one that promised freedom not only in heaven, but in the truth of their being. Their prayers were not pleas for mercy, but affirmations of dignity. In the depths of their suffering, they experienced a kind of spiritual clarity that the powerful could never comprehend. Their endurance was their redemption, and their ability to love despite everything was their victory. The enslaved men and women who lived under the widow's roof were the silent chroniclers of a civilization's hypocrisy. They saw the contradiction between the sermons preached in Charleston's churches and the cruelty practiced behind closed doors. They understood that the ones who called themselves pure were often the most defiled. Yet they did not let hatred consume them, for hatred is another form of bondage. Instead, they turned inward, transforming pain into strength, grief into song. This quiet transformation was the beginning of something much larger than themselves. It was the birth of a collective soul that would one day demand justice. In every sigh, every whispered lullaby to a child born into slavery, there was a message carried across time that no human being can truly own another. The enslaved of Charleston, though crushed beneath the weight of suffering, carried the memory of freedom within them like an ancestral inheritance. They were the living conscience of a city that had lost its soul, the keepers of a truth that would one day awaken. Their existence, though unseen and unrecorded, was a testimony that even in the darkest corners of history, the light of the human spirit does not die. It endures, waiting for the day when justice will remember its name. The silence that surrounded the widow of Charleston's crimes was not the absence of knowledge, but the presence of collective denial. Every person in her social circle knew pieces of her truth, the whispers that drifted through parlors, the strange absence of certain daughters at public events, the uneasy glances exchanged when her household was mentioned. Yet, no one dared to speak openly. That silence was not born of ignorance, but of complicity, a shared decision to preserve the illusion of morality at the cost of truth. The city itself became an accomplice to her sins, a living organism sustained by the suppression of conscience. Silence became a shield, not for innocence, but for corruption. Each citizen who chose not to see, not to question, contributed a thread to the shroud that covered Charleston's darkest secret. The horror of the widow's acts did not thrive in isolation. It survived through the cowardice of the many who valued comfort over justice and reputation over righteousness. The silence of Charleston was the softest form of violence. It required no weapon, no law, only the quiet acceptance of what should never have been tolerated. In that silence, evil found its safest refuge. The widow was not merely one monstrous woman. She was the manifestation of her community's hidden desires and fears. The citizens needed her to exist because she represented the unspoken truth of their world. The prosperity of their society depended on the suffering of others. Her cruelty was a mirror reflecting the collective rot beneath their refined civility, and so they averted their eyes. The preacher who condemned sin on Sunday dined with her on Monday. The merchant who traded goods knew that his profits came from the hands of those enslaved. The women who upheld the moral order of Charleston taught their daughters to look away, to stay silent, to never speak of such things. This silence was not neutral. It was an active preservation of the lie that sustained their world. The psychology of this collective denial runs deep. When a society builds its wealth and order upon injustice, it must create myths to justify its existence. Those myths become more powerful than truth. The people of Charleston told themselves that slavery was natural, that their social hierarchy was divine, that suffering was inevitable. To admit otherwise would mean tearing apart the foundation of their identity. The widow's actions were horrifying, but acknowledging them would have forced the city to face its own reflection. It is easier to condemn evil when it exists far away, in someone else's home, but when it stands next door, in the mansion of a respected widow, it becomes unbearable. So they buried it beneath layers of politeness and denial, pretending that civility could cleanse blood. But beneath every grand gesture of Southern hospitality was a trembling fear. The fear that the truth, if ever spoken, would expose the entire structure of their society as a moral illusion. This silence was also self-preservation. To speak against the widow would have been to challenge the institution that empowered her, and that institution fed everyone. The economy, the class hierarchy, the social order, all depended on keeping the system untouched. The conscience of Charleston was a fragile thing, easily crushed under the weight of necessity. The citizens' refusal to act was not just cowardice, but a psychological defense mechanism. They silenced their own discomfort through ritual, through religion, through rationalization. They said prayers not for the enslaved, but for their own peace of mind. They hosted gatherings, played music, built churches, and filled the air with distractions. Every surface of their lives was polished to perfection, so that no one would see the cracks beneath. In this way, silence became not only complicity, but an addiction, an anesthetic that dulled the collective conscience. But silence has consequences. It does not erase guilt, it amplifies it in the shadows of the collective mind. The more Charleston denied its sins, the more haunted it became. Whispers turned into unease, unease into shame, shame into superstition. People began to sense something rotten that no amount of elegance could hide. The city itself began to carry an invisible weight, a heaviness in the air, as if its soul was slowly suffocating. The widow's mansion, once a place of prestige, became an unspoken symbol of corruption. Even those who defended her felt the quiet dread that comes when truth is buried alive. In the human psyche, repression always leads to distortion. A society that refuses to face its guilt eventually projects that guilt onto others, seeking scapegoats to absorb its shame. Charleston would go on to defend slavery with even greater ferocity, not because it was right, but because it could not bear to confront the horror it had already accepted. The widow's story thus became a secret not only of one family, but of a civilization. Her actions were the concentrated expression of an entire culture's moral blindness. The silence surrounding her was the silence of the church, the court, and the dinner table, a silence that spanned generations. It was the silence of mothers teaching their daughters never to question, of fathers warning their sons not to interfere. It was the silence of profit, of survival, of fear dressed in respectability. This is how evil hides, not in the darkness of ignorance, but in the comfort of the familiar. The people of Charleston did not need to be monsters to allow monstrous things. They only needed to look away. And yet, even in that suffocating silence, the truth waited. History has a way of uncovering what humanity tries to forget. The collective guilt of Charleston could not be buried forever. The echoes of those crimes lingered in the land, in the stories told by descendants, in the unmarked graves beneath the soil. The silence became a curse, a restless reminder that no injustice remains hidden forever. The city's wealth, its charm, its pride, all of it carried the invisible stain of what had been done in the shadows. The widow may have died with her secret, but the silence that protected her eventually began to unravel. Every generation that followed would feel its weight, though few would name it. The collective guilt of silence teaches that evil rarely thrives through action alone. It thrives through the consent of those who know and do nothing. The people of Charleston learned to live with contradiction, to speak of virtue while benefiting from vice, to honor God while denying His image in others. That is the essence of moral decay, when silence becomes more valuable than truth and comfort becomes more sacred than justice. The widow's secret was a reflection of Charleston's soul, a testament to how societies lose their humanity not in moments of violence, but in moments of quiet acceptance. In that silence, the conscience of a city was buried, and with it, the humanity of all who refused to speak. Lies in the inevitable confrontation with the shadow, the haunting return of what was buried, the re-emergence of truth that no silence, no denial, no polished civility can suppress forever. Every collective act of moral suppression generates its own counterforce. What the widow of Charleston and her city tried to conceal became a spiritual infection that festered in the unseen depths of their shared psyche. They believed they could bury guilt beneath grandeur, that if they adorned their sins with lace and manners, they could rewrite reality itself. But guilt, unacknowledged, transforms into destiny. What is not faced consciously becomes fate. Charleston's silent complicity with the widow's evil was not a chapter that could be closed. It was a seed planted in the soil of the human spirit, destined to grow into future suffering. The more they repressed their collective shame, the more violent its eventual return would become, for the shadow of history always demands recognition. In this sense, the widow's crime was not confined to her generation. It transcended time. The energy of her actions, the breeding of human lives as property, created a psychic wound that bled into the collective consciousness of the region. Her daughters were both victims and instruments of her design, and through them, the trauma multiplied. Every child born of that cruelty carried within them a lineage of pain and memory. The enslaved women, their children, and even the white descendants of the household, all were chained to the same unspoken curse. For when one soul is violated in silence, the entire moral fabric of humanity is torn. That tear does not mend through forgetting. It demands acknowledgement. The history of the widow's house was not erased with her death. It became an invisible architecture within the soul of Charleston itself, shaping its fears, its pride, its resistance to truth. The return of the repressed always comes in disguised forms. Sometimes it comes as rumor, whispers of ghostly cries from the mansion at night, strange happenings that townsfolk cannot explain but feel compelled to fear. Sometimes it returns as an unspoken dread, a discomfort that arises when the city celebrates its heritage, a subtle sense that beneath the music and the magnolia trees lies something unclean. The shadow of Charleston, born from that hidden cruelty, expressed itself not just in superstition, but in history itself. Decades later, when the nation tore itself apart in civil war, when the same city burned and bled, it was as if the ghosts of the widow's victims rose to demand recognition. The sins of one woman and the silence of one city had become part of the collective karma of a nation. What is unhealed in the past always reappears, forcing itself upon the present until it is seen, named, and integrated. The haunting of Charleston is not a story of ghosts in a house, but of guilt in a people. The widow's mansion may have been reduced to dust, its walls crumbled and its gardens reclaimed by time, but the essence of what occurred there still lingers. It lingers in the stories that were never told, in the bloodlines that were hidden, in the unease that arises when descendants speak of ancestry. The shadow of this history is not confined to the oppressor alone. It touches the descendants of the oppressed as well. They carry the memory in their bodies, in the silence of their ancestors, in the unspoken pain that has been inherited like a secret language. The haunting, therefore, is mutual. The descendants of the guilty are haunted by shame, while the descendants of the enslaved are haunted by grief. Both sides remain bound until truth breaks the silence. The psychological essence of haunting is that the past never truly disappears. When a society refuses to confront its moral failures, they manifest as anxiety, unrest, or recurring cycles of violence. The Widow of Charleston represents a personal embodiment of this larger phenomenon. Her house was a microcosm of her civilization, a place of outward order and inward corruption. When the mind refuses to face its own evil, it divides itself, creating a double life, one visible, one hidden. The same division exists in cultures. Charleston, with its beauty and charm, built its identity upon denial. It celebrated grace while concealing brutality. This duality could not endure forever. The shadow that was denied would find its way back, whether through war, rebellion, or the slow erosion of moral certainty. The return of the repressed is not vengeance, it is balance. Nature, whether personal or collective, seeks wholeness, and that wholeness demands that all truths, even the darkest, be seen. The re-emergence of the widow's story in whispers and history books centuries later is itself part of this process of reckoning. Every time her name is spoken, every time her cruelty is acknowledged, a fragment of truth is restored to consciousness. Humanity evolves not through forgetting its evil, but through confronting it. The retelling of her deeds, not as sensational history, but as moral reflection, is the act of bringing shadow into light. The very discomfort people feel when hearing of her crimes is a sign that conscience, long buried, is awakening. The story of Charleston's widow forces us to look inward and ask, what do we still silence today? What truths do we refuse to name because they threaten our comfort? In this way, the haunting becomes not merely a curse, but a teacher, reminding us that no civilization can escape its reflection. The haunting also reveals the spiritual law that every act of evil once committed demands transformation. The only way to break the curse of silence is through truth. The shadow, once acknowledged, loses its destructive power and becomes a source of wisdom. The widow's story, when brought into awareness, becomes not just a tale of horror, but a revelation of how human beings fracture their own souls in pursuit of power. The lesson is not confined to her time. It applies wherever moral blindness hides behind respectability, wherever comfort outweighs compassion, wherever history is rewritten to erase pain. The haunting, in this sense, is universal. It whispers in every society that has buried its guilt beneath the illusion of righteousness. Charleston's ghosts are not confined to cemeteries. They live in memory, in culture, in the unspoken rhythm of the city's life. The wind that moves through its streets still carries the breath of those who suffered unseen. The repressed past, once awakened, becomes a force of moral clarity. It asks not for revenge, but for remembrance. To confront the haunting is to accept that history is not a linear timeline, but a living presence, one that shapes who we are until we dare to face it. The widow of Charleston may have used her daughters to breed slaves, but it was Charleston itself that bred silence, denial, and guilt. The haunting of that silence is the voice of the human conscience, eternal and unyielding, reminding us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always return to claim its place in the light.